Richie Sambora and Bon Jovi were never marketed as mere co-workers. For fans, they were the rare kind of partnership that felt mythic. Two Jersey musicians who climbed from small clubs to stadiums, carrying the same blue-collar grit in their sound. John was the recognizable face, voice, charisma, the brand's focal point. Richie was the musical counterweight, the guitar tone, the harmonies, the emotional shading that made the anthems feel lived in instead of manufactured. Together, they didn't just perform songs, they built a shared identity that millions of people attached to. That is why the story doesn't land as simple band drama. When one half of a legendary duo walks away, audiences don't just ask what happened. They ask what was real. This transcript frames the break as a slow fracture rather than one explosive fight. The early years are painted as genuine brotherhood. Late-night gigs, relentless hustling, mutual admiration for storytellers like Springsteen, and a chemistry that made the band sound feel both massive and intimate. But even in the golden era, platinum records, sold-out tours, the script suggests a silent hierarchy was taking shape. John was increasingly positioned as the frontman brand, the default face of Bon Jovi, while Richie, despite co-writing hits and shaping the sonic DNA, stood just outside the spotlight center. That imbalance is the first pressure point. In creative partnerships, credit is not only about ego, it's about belonging. If you believe you helped build the house, being treated like furniture is an existential insult. And the transcript implies that over time, Richie's role shifted from equal collaborator to background support. Still present, still performing, but increasingly unheard when it came to direction, decisions, and legacy. The story then raises the stakes by emphasizing how relentless success can become corrosive. Constant touring, constant production, constant pressure to maintain the machine leaves little space for emotional recalibration. Richie's personal struggles, addiction, divorce, and the emotional wear of living inside a brand that no longer felt safe are portrayed as amplifiers of that alienation. Not because he was weak, but because the environment had stopped functioning like a brotherhood and started functioning like a corporation. By the time Richie leaves in 2013, the transcript argues it wasn't one bad day. It was years of erosion finally reaching a breaking point. The pain isn't only that he exits, it's how. The script highlights a gut-level humiliation. Learning the band continued without him, and even hired a replacement without a direct conversation. In that framing, Richie doesn't feel simply replaced, he feels erased. This is the central hook, the collapse of a myth. The duo that once looked inseparable becomes a story of distance and silence. And the transcript sets up the question that haunts fans most. If the music was built on brotherhood, what does it mean when the brotherhood ends without closure? The transcript takes us back to New Jersey before the world knew the name Bon Jovi. It's a familiar American rock blueprint. Working-class towns, small venues, loud amps, and bigger dreams than anyone around you thinks are reasonable. John is presented as the natural frontman, ambitious, disciplined, and already thinking in terms of audience. Richie is framed as the musician's musician, emotionally tuned, blues-influenced, built for nuance. Their early paths were separate, but the shared influences were the same. The storytelling ambition of Springsteen, the swagger and power of classic rock, and the belief that songs should feel like lived experience, not just entertainment. When Richie joins the band in 1983, the transcript treats it as a turning point, not a simple lineup change. The implication is that Sambora didn't merely fill a guitar slot. He completed the band's emotional geometry. That is an important distinction. Many bands can replace an instrumentalist and keep the brand intact. But in Bon Jovi's classic era, the sound was not only about John's vocal presence. It was also about how the guitar lines and harmonies carried the emotional subtext. The transcript emphasizes Richie's role as a kind of unsung architect of the band's signature feeling. Listen to the way the narrative describes the key moments. The talkbox solo on Livin' on a Prayer, the brooding riffs of Wanted Dead or Alive, the sincerity in I'll Be There For You. Whether you agree with every flourish of the script or not, the argument is coherent. Richie's contributions were structural. His playing wasn't just technical, it was storytelling. His solos weren't random showcases. They functioned like narrative arcs, mini scenes that expanded what the lyrics were trying to say. His harmony vocals, too, are framed as crucial because they turn John's lead into a communal chorus. That is how arena rock becomes arena rock. The audience doesn't just listen, it joins. And for a long time, the onstage bond appeared to match the offstage reality. The transcript paints a picture of backstage laughter, brotherly energy, and a sense that they were enduring the madness together. But then it introduces the concept that quietly changes everything, a hierarchy forming beneath the brotherhood. This is where the story shifts from nostalgia to tension. The transcript suggests that even at their most united, John was increasingly positioned by management, by media, by the needs of branding, as the face of the enterprise. This is not unusual. In commercial rock, the face becomes the continuity plan. The face is the simplest narrative for the public to understand. The face is also the safest anchor for business decisions. Marketing, touring, press, image, sponsorship, and long-term legacy management. The problem is that what is good for the brand is not always good for the partnership. If Richie truly felt he was a co-author of the band's identity, and the transcript insists he was, then being treated as secondary is not a small insult. It changes the relationship from "we built this together" to "I built this too, but I'm being asked to stand a step behind." Over time, that kind of asymmetry becomes corrosive, especially in an environment where the schedule is relentless and the stakes are always high. The transcript's point is subtle but important. The fracture was not created by one argument, one scandal, or one betrayal that makes tabloid headlines. It was created by repetition, by 1,000 small moments where Richie's influence felt smaller than his contribution. Success in this framing didn't just elevate them. It narrowed the space where equality could survive. And that sets the stage for the later collapse. Because when a partnership's foundation shifts from shared authorship to managed hierarchy, the bond can still look intact from the outside. The music can still sound massive. The smiles can still appear in photos. But internally, the story stops feeling like us. It starts feeling like the business, and someone always pays the personal price for that transition. The transcript makes one argument over and over in different language. Richie Sambora was not simply the guitarist. He was part of the band's emotional operating system. And once you accept that premise, the later fallout feels less like celebrity gossip and more like a structural collapse, because you're no longer talking about a personnel change. You're talking about the removal of a co-author. In the classic Bon Jovi era, the music worked because it balanced two forms of power. John Bon Jovi delivered clarity, a lead voice built for radio, a frontman presence built for arenas, and a brand identity that made the band legible to a mass audience. Sambora delivered texture, the blues-leaning phrasing, the harmonic depth, the instinct for when a song needed restraint versus when it needed a surge. The transcript calls this the soul behind the strings, which is dramatic, but it points at a practical truth. Sambora's playing is rarely about flash for its own sake. It's about emotional punctuation. Think about what the transcript highlights as examples. Livin' on a Prayer, Wanted Dead or Alive, I'll Be There For You. These are songs that live or die by how convincingly they translate emotion into mass participation. The talkbox hook in Livin' on a Prayer is a branding signature, yes, but it's also a narrative tool. It sounds like urgency, like a working-class dream turning into a sprint. Wanted Dead or Alive carries a particular blend of romance and loneliness. The guitar has to breathe to make that tension believable. I'll Be There For You needs sincerity without collapsing into sentimentality, and the guitar lines help keep the feeling grounded. The transcript also insists on Sambora's restraint and intuition. That matters because restraint is what separates a timeless arena anthem from a dated artifact. In mid-'80s, glam metal often leaned into spectacle so hard that it became cartoonish. Sambora's blues sensibility, his bends, phrasing, and tonal warmth gave Bon Jovi a different kind of credibility. It added grit. It added heart. It made the songs feel like they belonged to people, not just to the era. Then, there is the second pillar the transcript keeps returning to: harmony. Sambora's voice isn't a background decoration in the classic records. It's a force multiplier. Harmonies turn a chorus from lead singer performing into crowd singing. That is not a small difference. It's the difference between a hit and an anthem. It's the difference between applause and unity. In arena rock, unity is the product. So when the transcript argues that history elevated John as the frontman while treating Sambora as secondary, the implication is not merely bruised ego. It's the fear of historical revision, that the world will remember the brand image more than the true architecture of the sound. For a musician whose identity is fused to that architecture, being pushed to the margins isn't just disrespect. It's erasure. This is why the transcript's silent hierarchy theme is so powerful. A hierarchy does not have to be officially announced to be felt. It can be built from repetition. Whose voice carries in meetings, whose preferences define the set list, whose vision shapes the image, whose name is treated as synonymous with the group. The transcript suggests that as Bon Jovi grew into a global machine, John's role as the face turned into an internal gravitational force. Decisions centralize around the face because the face is the continuity plan. The bigger the brand, the more management, media, and commercial logic will funnel authority toward whatever preserves continuity. In that environment, collaboration can become performative. Sambora can be physically present in rehearsals, sessions, tours, and still feel unheard. And the transcript frames this as the most corrosive part: being there, but not having a voice. That kind of dynamic quietly changes a person. It turns loyalty into endurance. It turns brotherhood into a job. At the same time, the transcript recognizes that Sambora's personal life was destabilizing. It references struggles with addiction and the emotional impact of divorce, and it frames these not as tabloid spectacle, but as vulnerability. Vulnerability becomes dangerous in a machine that demands predictability. A touring schedule does not pause for emotional crises. A brand does not comfortably accommodate instability. When a member is hurting, the enterprise can treat that pain as a threat to operations rather than a call for care. Even when no one intends cruelty, the result can feel cold. This is where the transcript's language shifts from cracks to corrosion. The pressure was not explosive, it says. It was corrosive. That's a precise idea. Explosions are visible and narratively clean. A fight, a scandal, a clear moment where everything changes. Corrosion is invisible until suddenly the structure fails. You can keep smiling for photos while the bond rots behind closed doors. By the time the transcript reaches the 2013 exit, it frames it as the culmination of years of emotional drift. Sambora is no longer leaving one bad day. He is leaving a long season of feeling undervalued, restricted, and unsafe inside the environment. And then comes the detail the transcript treats as the final humiliation. The sense that the band moved on without him in a way that required no conversation. If you accept the brothers myth, that is the ultimate rupture. Brothers don't replace brothers via the internet. Brothers call. Now, it is important to recognize what the transcript is doing rhetorically. It is constructing a moral arc. Sambora as the heart and truth, John as the face and machine. That kind of storytelling creates drama and clarity. Real life is usually messier. But even if you discount some of the script's dramatic framing, the underlying pattern is believable because it is common in long-running creative enterprises. The shift from art to operation, from collaboration to governance, from friendship to structure. And once governance becomes the main reality, the partnership becomes less about affection and more about power. Who decides, who is heard, who is protected, and who is expendable when the machine must keep moving. The transcript is not merely telling a rock story. It is describing how a myth survives on stage while a relationship dissolves off stage. And why? When the myth finally cracks, fans feel like they are hearing the songs differently. The transcript's most revealing move is that it refuses the kind of breakup story fans are trained to expect. There is no single villainous moment, no headline-grabbing confrontation, no courtroom drama. Instead, it presents the Sambora, Bon Jovi fracture as something quieter and, in many ways, more unsettling. A partnership that dissolved through governance, omission, and silence. That matters because silence is not neutral. In long-running creative relationships, silence is often the final language people speak when they no longer believe conversation will change anything. In the early years, the transcript paints an almost archetypal brotherhood. Shared struggle, shared victories, a sense that the band was a family battling the world together. But once Bon Jovi became a global institution, the internal ecosystem changed. It wasn't just 4 or 5 musicians making music. It was an enterprise with schedules, contracts, revenue targets, brand management, and an audience that expected the show to look the same every night. The larger the machine, the less room there is for messy human reality. This is the environment in which the transcript introduces its central tension, John becoming the face of the brand in a way that didn't simply affect media perception, but altered internal power. Even if everyone publicly insisted they were equal brothers, the operating logic shifted. The face becomes the continuity plan. The continuity plan becomes the decision center. And the decision center inevitably controls the narrative of the past, the direction of the future, and the boundaries of disagreement. The transcript frames Richie Sambora's experience as being there without being heard. This is an important psychological detail. When a person feels unheard, they begin to reinterpret everything around them through the lens of exclusion. A cold meeting becomes evidence. A quick decision becomes proof. A lack of consultation becomes humiliation. It is not that each event is necessarily malicious. It is that the pattern accumulates into a lived reality. My presence doesn't equal my voice. Then the transcript tightens the story by layering Sambora's personal struggles. It references addiction and divorce, and it portrays Richie as vulnerable and searching for stability while the band environment offers less and less comfort. Here the narrative becomes more than creative disagreement. It becomes a mismatch between human needs and institutional demands. A legacy act is not designed to be tender. It is designed to be reliable. That reliability can be brutal. Tour dates do not care about emotional collapse. Production timelines do not pause for grief. Management structures do not naturally reward the person who says, "I can't do this anymore." They reward the person who can keep the machine running. Even if no one intends cruelty, the system tends to treat pain as operational risk. This is why the transcript uses the word toxic. In popular culture, toxic can mean anything from abusive behavior to simple incompatibility. In this script, it seems to mean an environment that felt unsafe because it no longer functioned like a relationship. It functioned like a corporation, transactional, hierarchical, and optimized for continuity rather than mutual care. And this is where the transcript makes its sharpest claim, that the true heartbreak was not what outsiders said, but the internal indifference Sambora felt from people he once considered brothers. That is a familiar form of adult betrayal. Public criticism is noise. Private indifference is devastation. If you're already struggling, emotionally, physically, spiritually, being treated like a replaceable part doesn't just hurt your pride, it destabilizes your identity. The transcript then describes a slow drift. Sambora continues to perform, continues to tour, continues to play the role, but emotionally he begins to detach. That is also a crucial point. Many relationships end long before the formal break. The formal break is simply the moment the outside world finally catches up to what has been true privately for years. When April 2013 arrives in the transcript, it is framed as the moment the corrosion becomes visible. A show in Calgary. A soudaine absence. Personal reasons. No clear timeline. No explanation that satisfies the audience. Fans initially interpret it as temporary, health, family, a break. But as the weeks stretch into months, the absence becomes a new reality. Then comes the detail the script uses like a knife. Sambora, allegedly learning the band, continued without him and hired Phil X through the internet. Whether that is precisely how it happened or not, the emotional symbolism is clear. If the partnership was truly brotherhood, such news would be delivered person to person. If it is delivered indirectly, it signals that brotherhood has already been replaced by structure. This is why the transcript speaks of erasure. Erasure isn't only being replaced. It is being replaced in a way that implies you no longer deserve the courtesy of direct communication. Erasure is the feeling that your years of contribution have been reduced to a blank space the machine can fill without hesitation. And yet, the transcript is careful to avoid the kind of tabloid explosion that would make Bon Jovi look openly cruel. Instead, it paints him as something more complex and perhaps more realistic, a steward of the institution. A person who focuses on forward motion, minimizes public drama, and keeps the enterprise stable, even if that stability comes at the cost of emotional closure. That raises the most uncomfortable idea in the entire narrative. Sometimes no one wins a breakup like this. The machine wins. The machine doesn't need friendship to function. It needs only continuity and control. So the partnership dissolves in silence. No dramatic public feud, no cathartic final conversation, just years of mutual avoidance and fans left to fill the void with rumors. The transcript suggests that silence spared the band's dignity, but it also left an emotional debt unpaid. Without a clear ending, the story becomes mythic in the worst way. It invites endless speculation and turns real people into symbols. John as the brand, Richie as the soul. That is why, in the script's framing, Sambora breaking his silence matters. It isn't only about assigning blame. It is about reclaiming humanity from a narrative that has been dominated for years by the needs of the machine. And it sets up the next question the transcript wants the audience to ask. If the partnership ended because the band became a corporation, can it ever be rebuilt without turning both men into a tribute act to their own past? The transcript treats the 2013 departure not as a sudden betrayal, but as the moment a private collapse finally became public. That distinction is crucial. Fans remember the shock. One day Richie Sambora is part of the machine. The next day, he is absent and the band's official explanation is thin enough to invite panic. Personal reasons. But the script insists that the real story began years earlier, in the slow grind of touring, the quiet shift in power, and the steady feeling of being sidelined inside a legacy you helped build. In April 2013, the transcript says Bon Jovi fans were blindsided just hours before a show in Calgary. The band announced Sambora would not perform. There was no timeline, no detail, no reassuring narrative. That vacuum immediately became the story. In the modern media ecosystem, a vacuum is not empty for long. It is filled by speculation. Fans debated health, addiction, family crisis, backstage fights, and secret deals. The more iconic the partnership, the more dramatic the theories. A band can't survive rumors. But a brotherhood myth cannot survive silence without transforming into something darker. At first, many people assumed it was temporary. That is the natural reaction when a major member steps away. Temporary implies unity. We're still a family. One brother is taking a break. But as weeks became months, the assumption shifted. Temporary turned into something is wrong, and something is wrong turned into something is broken. The transcript describes Sambora privately reaching a breaking point, burnout after years of relentless pace, creative disputes, and frustration about diminished influence. It frames his internal state as more than exhaustion. It is depletion, not just physically tired, but spiritually drained. And it introduces a decisive reframe. The band no longer felt like a brotherhood, but like a business. That phrase matters because it signals a change in what the relationship means. A brotherhood implies emotional bonds that can tolerate conflict. A business implies roles that can be replaced. Once you experience the group as a business, the moral rules change. Loyalty is no longer sacred. It is conditional. The transcript then lands on its most emotionally brutal detail. Sambora allegedly discovering, through the internet, that the band went on tour without him and hired Phil X. In the script, that moment is described as a gut punch because it carries a message larger than any contract. You are not important enough to call. Even if you strip away the dramatic language, the symbolism is clear. If you're truly a founding partner in a lifelong project, replacement conversations happen directly. Indirect discovery signals that the relationship has already shifted into a transactional mode. It isn't just that someone else is playing your parts. It's that the system no longer believes it owes you the courtesy of personal communication. That is where the transcript uses the word erased. The fear is not merely being replaced. It is being replaced in a way that suggests the machine can edit you out and keep the story intact. For fans, that is unsettling because the music they love is tied to Sambora's distinctive fingerprints, his tone, his harmonies, his melodic instinct. The transcript positions him as the emotional core of the classic sound, so the idea of him being erased doesn't feel like a lineup change. It feels like rewriting history. But the transcript also introduces a counterweight: fatherhood. Over time, the script says, Sambora increasingly cited his daughter Ava as a central reason for stepping away. The touring schedule did not allow him to be present in her life at a formative age. You don't get those years back becomes the moral anchor. This is an important narrative move because it prevents the story from becoming purely about ego and conflict. It recasts the departure as self-preservation and parental responsibility. And yet, the transcript doesn't let Sambora off the hook entirely. It frames his departure as deeply personal, but acknowledges the confusion and pain it caused. That ambiguity is the fuel for the long-running fan obsession. If Richie left for family, why was the exit handled with such silence? If the environment was toxic, why didn't the public ever hear a clear explanation? The unanswered questions keep the story alive. The transcript also emphasizes the media silence that followed. No dramatic interviews. No public mudslinging. That quiet spared the band a tabloid war, but also created a decade of unresolved narrative tension. Fans were left to interpret the silence as either dignity or avoidance. And silence, in a high-profile breakup, can be both at once. In this framing, Bon Jovi's posture is also strategic. He moves forward with the band as it exists, focusing on continuity rather than revisiting old wounds. The transcript suggests he was more invested in keeping the brand stable than in relitigating the past. That may read cold to some fans, but it is also consistent with how institutions behave. Institutions survive by prioritizing forward motion. So the 2013 departure becomes more than a date in a timeline. It becomes a case study in how legacy acts fracture, not always through a fight, but through the logic of the machine. The machine keeps touring. The machine keeps selling tickets. The machine installs a replacement. And the human beings who built it are left wrestling with a different question than fans ask. Fans ask, why couldn't they work it out? The transcript suggests a harsher question. What happens when working it out is no longer the point? Because the system has evolved beyond the relationship that created it. The transcript frames 2024 as the moment the story finally shifts from rumor to reflection. The year Richie Sambora stops letting the silence speak for him. After more than a decade of distance, he offers something fans rarely get from legacy breakups: accountability without surrender, regret without full reversal. He admits the exit was abrupt. He acknowledges he ghosted. And he concedes that, at minimum, he should have talked to Bon Jovi directly and explained what was happening. That admission is more than a personal confession. It is a strategic correction. For years, Sambora's absence allowed the public to write its own narrative, often in extremes. Either he abandoned the band irresponsibly, or he was pushed out by a cold, corporate machine. When Sambora publicly owns the messiness of his departure, he takes back some authorship. He tells fans, You were right to feel confused, and I understand why my silence hurt. But the transcript also makes clear that the apology does not equal surrender to the old mythology. Sambora's remorse is about how he left, not necessarily why he left. The script emphasizes that the decision came from years of emotional buildup, feeling unheard, creatively constrained, and personally depleted. In this framing, the apology is not an invitation to relive the past. It is an attempt to close an open wound without pretending the wound never existed. This is where the narrative becomes particularly human. Most people can relate to the idea of leaving a situation for valid reasons, but doing it in a flawed way. The transcript leans into that realism. Sambora chose self-preservation and family priorities, but he recognizes he left people in the dark. Fans, bandmates, a community that had invested emotionally in the brothers' story. That is why the apology resonates. It doesn't rewrite history into a fairy tale. It admits the cost. The transcript then contrasts this with Bon Jovi's response, which it characterizes as measured and final. John does not publicly escalate. He does not trade accusations. Instead, he appears to acknowledge the sentiment while maintaining the boundary that the band has moved forward. That kind of response often frustrates fans because it lacks the emotional fireworks they expect from celebrity drama. But in institutional terms, it makes sense. John is positioned as the steward of the enterprise. His incentive is stability, protecting the band's present identity rather than reopening a conflict that could destabilize it. And the transcript argues that John's present context matters. Health, age, and the reality that the body becomes an uncompromising stakeholder in late career decisions. It references John's vocal issues and recovery process, suggesting that he is no longer chasing the past as a primary goal. Even the idea of a reunion, romantically appealing to fans, becomes operationally complex. Reunions are not just music. They are logistics, rehearsals, negotiations, and the emotional labor of rebuilding trust. When your physical capacity is limited, you naturally become more selective about what burdens you take on. This is the transcript's quiet reality check. The myth of reunion is often stronger than what the real reunion would be. Fans want the emotional time capsule. 1986 energy, 1990s power, the illusion that the decades in between didn't change anything. But both men have changed. Sambora's post-Bon Jovi life is framed as more balanced, more introspective, rooted in fatherhood and personal healing. John's life is framed as more controlled, more present-focused, shaped by the recognition that legacy is not only what you made, but what you choose not to risk destroying. In that light, Sambora's apology becomes less like a reunion announcement and more like a mature closing statement. It is an acknowledgement that the silence was painful, paired with an implicit message. I chose my well-being, and I still stand by that choice, but I regret the damage my disappearance caused. The transcript leaves the audience with a tension that cannot be neatly resolved. Reconciliation is not the same as reunion. Two people can respect each other, even forgive each other, and still decide that reopening the partnership is not healthy or realistic. For fans, that is unsatisfying. For adults who have lived through complicated endings, it is often the most believable outcome. And that is why the story remains compelling. Not because it promises a fairy tale return, but because it exposes something harder. Sometimes the most honest closure is not getting the ending you wanted, but understanding why the ending you wanted may no longer fit the lives of the people who created the myth in the first place. The transcript closes the way many legacy stories now end, not with a triumphant reunion, but with a quieter kind of truth. The myth can remain powerful even if the real people behind it no longer belong in the same frame. For fans, the dream is simple. Put Richie Sambora and Bon Jovi on a stage again. Let the first chord ring out and watch time fold back on itself. It would feel like proof that the brotherhood was real, that the cracks were temporary, that the songs still belong to the original hands that built them. But the transcript argues something more complicated and in many ways more adult. Reunion culture is often about what the audience needs, not what the artist can or should carry. By 2024, Sambora's posture is presented as reflective rather than combative. He regrets the way he disappeared. He understands the confusion and pain it caused. But he also frames his departure as an act of self-preservation and fatherhood, a refusal to keep sacrificing the life that mattered most to him beyond the stage. In the transcript's language, his greatest legacy isn't only in stadium choruses. It is in becoming present for his daughter and rebuilding a life with balance, therapy, and a quieter form of authenticity. John's posture, by contrast, is portrayed as deliberate and bounded. The transcript suggests he isn't driven by nostalgia. He respects the past, but he isn't interested in living inside it. His focus is sustaining what still works in the present. New music, the band's current configuration, and the realities of age and health. Where fans hear unfinished, he hears we had our run. Where fans hear longing, he hears limits. And that's the core message the transcript wants to leave with the audience. Sometimes a partnership ends not because of hatred, but because the rhythm that once held it together no longer exists. The magic was real in its season, but seasons end. Trying to resurrect them can sometimes damage the very legacy people are trying to honor. In that sense, the Sambora Bon Jovi story becomes a parable about reinvention. Sambora's evolution is framed as choosing truth over spectacle, less volume, more meaning. John's evolution is framed as choosing boundaries over sentiment, less romantic myth, more sustainable reality. Both are forms of strength, even if neither satisfies the audience's desire for a neat ending. The transcript's final emotional claim is that Sambora may have ghosted, but he was never forgotten. His tone, harmonies, and songwriting fingerprints still live in every classic hit, whether his name is spoken or not. That is the strange permanence of music. People can leave the room, but they cannot leave the record. And that leaves one lingering question, the one that keeps fans talking and keeps stories like this alive. If the greatest power of Bon Jovi's legacy is what John and Richie created together, is it better to protect that legacy by letting it remain untouched in memory, or is it worth risking imperfection for the chance of one honest, imperfect human moment on stage again?